Trump demanded Europe pay up for NATO. They are paying. He demanded 5% of GDP. They agreed. And now he's pulling US troops out anyway, while Europe writes new rules to freeze out American weapons makers. This isn't burden sharing. It's the controlled demolition of the transatlantic order, and someone's making a fortune. Let's start with what actually happened. In June 2025, at the Hague Summit, NATO allies made the commitment Trump had been screaming about for years. 5% of GDP on defense and security by 2035, with 3.5% going specifically to core defense requirements. This isn't a marginal increase. European NATO members spent 1.43% of combined GDP on defense in 2014. They crawled up to around 2% by 2024. Now they are promising to more than double that again. We are talking about the largest sustained military spending surge in Europe since the Cold War, possibly since rearmament in the 1930s. Trump won. He got his number, 5%. The European capitulation he'd been demanding since his first term. So naturally, he dialed back the threats, right? American troops would stay, the alliance would stabilize, and everyone would live happily ever after in a more equitably funded security architecture. Except that's not what happened. In December 2025, the Trump administration released its national security strategy. And it's a document that reads less like a vindication of burden sharing and more like a divorce filing. The strategy places primary responsibility for Ukraine and regional European security squarely on European shoulders. It questions whether European economies will remain, quote, reliable allies. It barely mentions Russia as a threat, and in a truly remarkable passage, it attributes tensions between Europe and Russia not to Russian aggression, but to NATO expansion and what it calls Europe's, quote, lack of self-confidence. The Kremlin spokesperson, Peskov, said the strategy was largely consistent with Russia's vision. That should tell you everything. And Trump didn't just write a mean strategy document, he's pulling troops. The Biden administration had increased US troop presence in Europe by roughly 20,000. Trump's team has already begun withdrawals, including the 2nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team from Eastern Europe. Congress tried to block this. They passed a $901 billion defense bill that prohibits Pentagon troop reductions in Europe below 76,000 without certification to Congress. But Trump's second term has featured an aggressive expansion of executive authority, and there are workarounds. Constitutional ambiguity over presidential control of force posture creates space for a president determined to hollow out commitments without formally triggering the legal prohibition on unilateral NATO withdrawal. So here's where it gets interesting economically. Because Europe, facing the prospect of American abandonment, didn't respond by opening the checkbook to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. They responded by slamming the door in American contractors' faces. The European Union's Rearm Europe plan aims to mobilize around 800 billion euros over 4 years. That's new loans, fiscal flexibility, reactivated savings. It's an enormous sum. And the fine print matters. The Safe Loan Instrument, 150 billion euros of it, mandates that 65% of procurement costs must originate from EU or EEA companies. There's a target to hit 55% European sourcing by 2030. Germany has 154 major defense purchases planned through 2026. Only 8% are going to US suppliers. 8%. Compare that to the recent past. From 2020 to 2024, roughly 64% of European defense procurement came from American contractors. From mid-2022 to mid-2023, 63% of EU defense orders went to American companies. The United States had a near monopoly on European military spending. That monopoly is now being systematically dismantled. Why does this matter? Because American defense contractors aren't just losing sales. They are losing access to their second largest market. US defense firms derive roughly 10% of total revenues from European exports. If Europe hits its spending targets and enforces local content rules, European contractors could capture approximately $40 billion in incremental annual spending. That's $40 billion that would have flowed to American shareholders, American workers in defense plants, American political action committees. It's gone. Redirected to European defense capital. And you can see it in the stock prices. European defense stocks have posted 550% returns since 2022. Their backlogs are up over 70%. Sales are up 17%. These are companies that were for decades afterthoughts in a market dominated by the American giants. Now they are getting guaranteed demand, protected from American competition, with EU governments essentially writing them blank checks under the banner of strategic autonomy. Let's zoom out institutionally for a moment, because this reveals something about how European power actually works. The European Union has spent the last 15 years lecturing its member states about fiscal discipline. The Stability and Growth Pact, the sacred text of European economic governance, sets strict limits on deficits and debt. When Greece needed fiscal space during the financial crisis, the answer was austerity. When countries wanted to spend on climate transition, on health systems, on social housing, Brussels said no. The rules are the rules. But now, for defense, the rules bend. The EU activated escape clauses in the Stability and Growth Pact, allowing deficit spending for military purposes up to 1.5% of GDP. The flexibility that was unavailable for keeping people alive is suddenly available for building weapons. This tells you which crisis European institutions actually prioritize and whose profits they are designed to protect. There's a historical parallel worth noting. In the 1930s, as British hegemony declined and the security guarantor began to withdraw, European states didn't just increase defense spending. They rebuilt autarkic, nationalist, military-industrial capacity. Integrated alliance structures fragmented. Every nation prioritized domestic production, domestic contractors, domestic supply chains. The result was a balkanized defense landscape that made collective security harder, not easier. We are watching a similar dynamic now. Europe today operates over 170 different weapons systems, compared to 30 in the United States. That's inefficiency by design. Every country protecting its own defense jobs, its own industrial base. And now, under the banner of strategic autonomy, that fragmentation is deepening. This isn't alliance strengthening, it's alliance dissolution with a marketing budget. So let's ask the obvious question. If Trump's goal was to get Europe to spend more on defense, and specifically to buy American weapons as part of that spending, why is he still withdrawing even after Europe said yes to 5%? And why isn't he demanding they buy American as a condition? The only explanation that makes sense is that burden sharing was never the real objective. Trump's strategy appears designed not to strengthen NATO, but to facilitate American retrenchment. Shift the costs, reduce the commitments, collapse the alliance structures, reorient toward either Asia or isolationism or both. The February 2025 meeting between Trump and Zelensky was described by sources as catastrophic. Trump reportedly berated and humiliated the Ukrainian president. This is not the behavior of someone trying to manage alliances. This is someone dismantling them. Now, let's be fair. There is a coherent case to be made here, and it goes like this. Europe is rich. It's been free riding on American security guarantees for 75 years. If Europeans finally take responsibility for their own defense, that frees up American resources, military and fiscal, to focus on the real threat, which is China. The US is overstretched. It can't police Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific simultaneously. Forcing Europe to stand on its own feet makes America stronger, not weaker. And the numbers seem to support this. NATO already spends 3.3 times more on defense than Russia's planned budget of $145 billion for 2025. If Europe moves to even 3% of GDP, that's an additional $260 billion annually. Surely that's enough to deter Moscow without American boots on the ground. It's a seductive argument. But it collapses under scrutiny. Because America isn't actually saving money. Congress just passed a $901 billion defense bill. They blocked troop reductions. The Pentagon budget isn't shrinking, it's growing. So where are the savings? Meanwhile, what America is losing is tangible. European export markets for contractors, 10% of total revenue for the defense sector. Forward military positioning that provides strategic depth and rapid response capability. Alliance interoperability that took decades to build. And geopolitical influence. The ability to shape European policy, to coordinate on China, on trade, on technology standards. All of that evaporates when you pull back. You don't save the cost of European defense. You just lose the revenue and the influence, while still spending more at home. So who actually wins? Let's be precise. The winners are European defense oligopolies and the financial capital that's recycling European savings into militarization. European households save 1.4 trillion euros annually, compared to 800 billion in the United States. But 300 billion of European savings flow outside the EU every year, into dollar assets, into American markets. Rearm Europe and the SAFE instrument are designed to capture that capital and redirect it toward domestic defense industrial base. It's a massive fiscal stimulus for European arms manufacturers, guaranteed returns for European finance capital, and a mechanism for keeping savings inside the EU. It's industrial policy dressed up as security policy. And on the American side, who wins? Not the defense contractors, clearly, not the workers in those plants, not the communities that depend on those export revenues. The only constituency that wins is the one that wants American retrenchment for its own sake. Either isolationists who never wanted global commitments, or strategists who think Europe is a distraction from Asia. But even that's questionable, because a fractured, renationalizing Europe is a less useful partner against China, not a more useful one. And then there's Russia. Moscow gets everything it wanted without having to fight for it. NATO fractures. The United States withdraws. Europe balkanizes into competing national defense projects. Trump's national security strategy literally echoes Kremlin talking points, blaming NATO expansion for European-Russian tensions and questioning European confidence. Peskov endorsed it. You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to see the alignment of interests here. Russia has spent decades trying to break the transatlantic alliance. Trump is doing it for them. Here's the bottom line. We are watching a controlled demolition. Trump demanded European defense spending increases, and he's getting them. But those increases aren't strengthening the alliance. They're financing its dissolution. European defense capital is capturing hundreds of billions in protected procurement. American defense capital is losing its European export markets. European governments are using the crisis to activate fiscal space they refused for social spending. American policymakers are using the crisis to justify retrenchment. And all of it is being sold to publics as burden sharing, as strategic autonomy, as hard-nosed realism. But the alliance that kept the peace in Europe for 75 years is disintegrating. The interoperability is being lost. The trust is gone. The coordination on everything from China to climate to technology standards is fracturing. And while defense spending surges on both sides of the Atlantic, actual security is deteriorating. Because security doesn't come from how much you spend. It comes from whether you have reliable partners when the crisis hits. So here's the question you should be asking. When defense spending surges, but alliances collapse, who's actually being defended? And who's just getting paid?